So, I'm Andy Gordon with 350 Massachusetts and the Better Future Project. I am the grassroots co-chair of the Coalition for a Clean Energy Future.
I'm Stephen Levy. I'm a member of Citizens Climate Lobby and 350.org in the Massachusetts chapter.
My name is David Radue. I'm a mechanical engineer at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, and in my part-time or off-time, I am the chair of the North Shore chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby.
So David, what can you tell us about this?
Well, where do you want to begin?
What's the problem in front of us? When you say climate change and climate change issues, what are the dangers we face from climate change? What are the problems?
Climate change, in short, is people changing the chemistry of the planet. When people use gasoline or natural gas or coal, that there's a chemical reaction, right? And that causes a specific gas, CO2, to enter the atmosphere. Now, I don't know if people remember their high school chemistry. It doesn't really matter. But what is important to recognize is that when you change the chemistry of a situation, it's going to react differently. And in the case of the Earth, which is a really complicated system, by increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, certain things happen. So specifically, we absorb more energy from the sun. The Earth gets a little bit warmer. It's not even, it's not uniform around the world, but there's more energy that we trap because of that gas. And then as a secondary effect, you see things like more carbon dioxide that gets in the oceans, which makes the oceans more acidic, which changes the behavior of that chemistry. After you've gone from those kind of first-tier effects, more energy and changes in specific chemistry, you get a whole bunch of secondary effects. What happens when you have more energy in the system? Well, for example, you get changes in precipitation, changes in rainfall, because certain areas now get more energy that causes more water to get pulled into the air. In other cases, you've got kind of shifts in wind patterns that change the way that water gets dropped in different places. So that's one kind of effect. Another effect, the oceans are just a little bit warmer. And when something has more energy going into it, in general, it gets a little bit bigger.
Some people, I was going to interrupt for a second.
Oh, go ahead.
Some people say, well, CO2 levels have been high, in our past. But this is, as I understand, is a little different because we are making changes 1,000 times or 10,000 times faster than what the planet is accustomed to in its history. How does that work out?
So if you ask scientists, have we ever had chemistry like this before? The answer is yes. If you go back millions of years, you'll find times when there was more carbon dioxide in the air, more carbon dioxide in the water. Trick is that humans have only been around for about 50,000 years, and we evolved in a particular climate that happens to have been really stable for that last 50,000 years. And if you compare the way the world looks now to what it was millions of years ago, you'll notice some big differences, like higher sea levels and changes in temperature and changes in weather. And those sorts of things don't really reflect the kind of world that humans have thrived in for so long. And the other thing that really jumps out is there are two considerations. There's both the point you are at and the speed at which you are changing. So let's say that we had been stable at a climate that was 2 degrees hotter for a long time. We'd probably be just fine with it. The plants would have changed to respond to it. The oceans, the shoreline, we'd know where it was. Things would be fine. But when things are changing, that puts stress on plants, that puts stress on animals, that changes shorelines, that changes weather patterns. That's the real problem.
I'm a diver, and I notice that when changes occur, you get invasive species, and things that would take thousands of years to move around then start moving around, and you get big distortions in the environment. I was going to ask you, what kinds of there have been a number of suggestions as to how we might beat this problem. Regulation, I understand carbon cap and trade. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the different possibilities that are in front of us. I know that the last one I mentioned, carbon pricing, carbon is one of your favorites. So if you could tell us something about those, our possibilities, and why carbon pricing is your favorite.
Okay. Well, actually, I'm going to jump in here and pass it over to Andrew, who can tell you a little bit about what the state of Massachusetts has gotten in place.
Beautiful. So the basics of a carbon fee, as offered in the state of Massachusetts, the kind of architect bill that you're looking at is offered by Senator Barrett the past 2 terms, so really since 2012. So the current number for the last term would be 1747, an act combating climate change. The whole point, the whole messaging behind a carbon fee is you want to hold polluters, including us, not just big businesses, but everyone living in the system, accountable for the actual cost of the pollution that we generate. So Dave talked about that a little bit in terms of higher sea levels, invasive diseases, things that naturally occur as a result of climate change. Those have direct monetary consequences that most consumers, most polluters aren't paying. So BP and Chevron and Exxon and utility companies aren't paying for increased costs of childhood asthma. They're not paying for property damage and homeowner insurance along the coast of Massachusetts. They're not paying for they are not paying for the cost of what they're putting out. And we're not paying the full cost as people who buy gasoline, as someone who buys home heating oil. It's me, I live in Brighton, Massachusetts, and I just filled up my tank for the winter, which was not cheap. But if I was paying the full cost of the pollution that I am emitting, I would be paying a lot more than the $500 to fill up my tank. So the point is, we want to be able to shift folks away from costly fossil fuel pollution towards renewable energy. The whole point of a carbon fee isn't just reducing emissions, it's helping to incentivize the shift towards renewable energy by thinking about by changing how we think about the cost of fossil fuels. So the basis of 1747, Senator Barrett's carbon fee, was to put out what is called a revenue neutral model of carbon pricing. So you get all this revenue in from folks, and the base of a carbon price in Massachusetts is when fossil fuels, we're an importer state. We don't generate our own natural gas. We're importing it in through pipelines. We're importing in home heating oil. We're importing in gasoline. That when companies have this fuel shipped in, they are assessed a fee once it crosses state lines. And the whole point is the bill assumes that corporations or those companies will pass along the fee to their consumers. So folks will experience that additional jump in price, small over time. And
I'm going to interrupt for a second. I want to ask you a question. The fact that we're a state versus the federal government.
Yep.
I saw an interview last night where they were arguing about what's going on at state level. And the argument on the state level was a little different from the federal level, because when someone's brought up, our coal miners are going to have no jobs, our oil workers are going to have no jobs. The person in the state where they don't have coal mines or oil fields said, that's not in our state, so it doesn't affect us. So your argument isn't as interesting as it might be on the national level. So might it be easier to pass this law in the state versus the federal government?
So anything regarding national stuff, I want to pass over to Dave, because CCL has done really great work on the national work. What I can say for the state level is, because Mass is not an extracting state, because we are not fracking, because we are not mining or drilling, we're not going to experience any kind of significant job loss. The only industries that would be affected by a carbon fee would potentially be manufacturing slightly, and then carbon-intensive businesses like concrete, for example, which is ironic for me. My uncle is actually in the concrete business up in Melrose, so sorry, Uncle Rich. But the nice thing about the Barrett bill is that it actually provides additional protections for those industries so they do not suffer that shock. One of the interesting things coming out of some of the additional studies that have been done around a mass-based carbon fee is that we would not see job leakage into other states. We would actually see an improvement in employment numbers. We would see an improvement in disposable income, because the other side of the carbon fee that I didn't get to and explain the basics is, once you've collected that fee money once it's been assessed on those companies. The whole point is then that money gets just redistributed evenly, at least in the Massachusetts version of the bill, for businesses, it's share of full-time employment, and then for individuals, it's by member of household. Dave's got some great numbers on what that looks like. But the whole point is people who emit more fossil fuels, the folks who can afford to transition, and the businesses that afford to transition, can do so, whereas lower income populations who are not going to have larger homes, who are not going to own multiple vehicles, actually come out ahead under most versions of a carbon fee. And it's got a lot of support amongst the business community as well.
So Steve, let's take a step back. You had asked the question of what are our options? Like, what are the policies that people have been talking about? And certainly climate change is something that as a country, as a world, we've been discussing for many, many years. But it's a hard problem to solve for governments, and there are a number of reasons why. Right? But first of all, you've got a lot of different people involved and a lot of different companies involved. You've got a lot of different stakeholders. Also, when I talked about the effects of climate change, while they're all bad, it's not that they're very acute. No individual effect is so painful that it causes one person to really change a position or it causes enough people to change a position. It's kind of like having a cold. If everyone's got a cold, they don't feel great, but they can probably still go to work. But they're not working as hard as they normally would, and they're stuffed up, and it's miserable. And eventually, that may lead to something worse than a cold, but people kind of muddle through for a while, and that's where we've been. Now, what are some things that we've done? Well, the common choice is regulation. And what does that mean? Well, if we take a look at this slide here, there are kind of two pathways people have explored. Regulations are when the government says, you need to do this, or you are not allowed to do this. So it's set specific rules. Think of it like chess. A knight moves forward 2 spaces and over 1. Very specific, very, very clearly defined. Regulations, your car must get at least 30 miles per gallon of gas. Very specific. Now, how does that get accomplished? It's up to the companies to figure it out. Regulations can be very effective, but with a problem like climate change that is so big and affects so many industries, it's really hard to get regulations right without making them really expensive. Because most regulations target one very specific thing. A good regulation is specific, but the downside of something specific is you can't really hit everyone the same way, and you can't hit everyone fairly. Right? There's a problem with fairness with regulations because to be able to regulate every industry and treat them all kind of equally, it requires something really challenging to put together.
I know firsthand that the regulations can vary quite a bit, and they're quite complex. You might even need an environmental lawyer to wade through some of these things. So that's one of the disadvantages of regulations.
Yeah, now regulations have their place. There's a reason we use them. But for a problem like this, there are some better options. A second idea that has been brought up is a concept called cap and trade. It works like this. The government says, okay, every company around the country, or every company in the state, for example, in the state of California, you are allowed to emit a certain amount of emissions. So you're given, let's say you're given 10 units of emissions that you can use every year. If you think you're going to use less than your share, you can trade those with other companies, and you can sell them. And then every year, the state or the federal government would reduce the total number of emissions that people could use. So let's say it starts at 100, and then every year they knock it down by 5. And so over time, everyone has to move away from causing pollution. Cap and trade worked really, really well in the 80s and early 90s to deal with the hole in the ozone layer. Well, the story goes like this. Aerosols that people were using in spray cans, particular kinds of chemicals, were causing damage, a specific kind of damage to the environment. And it turns out that only a very small number of companies were involved in making those. So many governments around the world got together. They reached an agreement that they were going to set up kind of this marketplace, this limits on how much companies could pollute and then reduce it over time. And it worked so well that they didn't even have to really reduce it. The companies kind of pulled back much faster than the governments had expected. And now the ozone layer has been repaired. We don't hear about that problem anymore. The problem with cap and trade in talking about climate change is that there are just way more people and way more companies involved. So it's not that the problem is a different scale. They're both global problems. It's just, it's much more complicated. Many more stakeholders. And for that reason, cap and trade has proven to be a little bit tricky. Europe has a cap and trade bill in place. China is exploring one. California has one. So it has been used successfully. But
additionally here as well.
So
in our electrical market is actually part of a regional cap and trade system called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's only for our electrical market, which is why at least any carbon pricing bill that has kind of come forward in Massachusetts has excluded electrical generation, so the electrical generators wouldn't be doubly hit, and we wouldn't see the kind of surge in electrical prices that the Associated Industries of Massachusetts is always talking about. So cap and trade, as far as RGGI is concerned, has been good because some of that money has been used to invest in, if I remember correctly, energy efficiency and smaller scale programs like that. But a full carbon fee, I think the thing that folks kind of miss often with electrical generation is that that's not where most of our emissions are coming from. And if this is an emissions problem, what we really have to do is find an equitable, and this is the key word, and Dave raised a really good word, fairness, an equitable way to deal with home heating, and the really big one's transportation. Oh my goodness, is transportation the big one. And not just in single occupancy vehicles, but also in public transit.
So here's the alternative idea, right? And Andrew,
So I guess now you're getting into the specifics of how this might work.
Oh yeah, I want to give you the sales pitch now. This is the fun part.
The good stuff.
And here's the visual aid to go with it. So the government, whether at the state level or the national level, would put a fee on fuels. They would do it wherever it was cheapest for the government to do, because you don't want it to cost a whole bunch of money. You don't want a lot of the money be wasted by the government, right? So you do it wherever the government programs already are kind of in place, the infrastructure is in place to collect a fee.
In Mass, that would be DOR, so the Department of Revenue.
Yeah. At the national level, it's the IRS, because they're used to collecting money. That's what they do. Right? Then you make the size of the fee consistent with the amount of damage caused by the fuel. So people talk about coal being a dirty fuel. Well, what does that mean? It actually means two things. Turns out when you burn coal, there's a lot of extra stuff that gets burned out and released in the atmosphere. Sulfur and a whole bunch of other chemicals.
There's a clean coal joke coming in here.
No. But separate from those things, coal also just creates more greenhouse gases. The chemistry of burning a unit of coal, it produces more carbon dioxide than the same amount of oil or gas. So you make the coal, you put a bigger fee on coal because it's causing more damage. Similarly, you put a fee on oil and you put a fee on gas, natural gas, based on how much damage they cause. You can also use this to adjust a little bit for some other things like methane in the atmosphere caused by natural gas, which is a little bit more of a potent, causes more damage per amount than the CO2. But anyway, punchline is you can adjust the fee based on how much damage is caused by fuel. When you put a fee on these fuels, as you'd expect, the price will go up for everyone across the economy, and that will drive demand down. People will use less. But what do you do with the money? And this is the part that's really cool. If you take the money and you give it back to households, or in the case of the state bill, you give some back to households and some back to businesses, you are protecting them from the increased costs, right? At the end of the month, your bank account is protected because you're getting as much back as you're putting in for the average person.
Let's say the bottom 60% of income.
Yeah, the bottom 60%. Most people are at least breaking even. But even if you're breaking even, you still see, hey, gas is more expensive today than it was 2 years ago. Maybe it's time to invest in a more efficient car. Or you say, man, the cost of heating my home is going up. If I put solar on my roof, I can use electric heaters and I can come out ahead. So it encourages you to make smarter energy decisions, even if your bank account is protected and you're not actually losing money in the process.
And for businesses, what this actually creates is an opportunity for a new competitive advantage. So two of the big climate business advocates in the state of Massachusetts, the Climate Action Business
Yeah, I'd like to
Association.
hear more about that. Yeah. So how does it create a business advantage?
So the same kind of thinking that Dave was talking about a second ago, saying, maybe it's time to invest. The reason why that person can make that decision or that calculation is because the whole point of a carbon fee is that the fee slowly goes up over time. So businesses and individuals can know, well, it's not going to get any cheaper next year. Even if the price of oil goes down, the fee is still going to be going up. So I should probably make these decisions earlier so that I get a bigger return on investment later. The kind of classic example that we kind of use around the table is it's two pizza shops, right? One can use the more energy efficient brick oven, or one can stick with what they're doing. Over time, the earlier decision to invest in the more emission-friendly device will save that business money and create a competitive advantage because they're not having to shell out the same kind of money for their older equipment.
And the fact that the fee keeps going up makes it more interesting every year.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
if you make the improvement this year and you pay back this year, next year you get even a bigger payback and bigger and
Exactly.
bigger and bigger and bigger. So it
exactly.
builds.
That's the whole point.
It's very good.
Yeah.
And what are we trying to get to? Well, let me ask you, how did you get here today?
I drove my Subaru.
You drove here. And
Yeah.
why did you drive? Probably because it works really well.
Well, because the bus would take an hour and a half to go 3 miles.
Hey, it took me an hour and a half to get from Brighton.
Yeah. So we use fossil fuels because they work really, really well in terms of how much time they take or how much energy they give us. And they're pretty cheap, honestly, right? If you want to go get a gallon of gas, think about how far you can drive for $2, right? It's cheap and it's effective. But it's not because you really like the smell of a gallon of gas. If you had an electric car that cost you the same amount of dollars and it worked just as well, you'd be fine using it. And if it was just a little bit cheaper or just a little bit better, you'd be like, hey, yeah, that's great. I'm happy to change. And that's really the key in moving away from fossil fuels. We have other alternatives. Solar, it turns out, has gotten a lot better in terms of the technology over the last 10 years. The amount of energy you can produce on a roof of a house is now enough to cover, in some cases, not only all of the household's needs, but maybe more than the household's needs. Right? So we have the capability to generate energy. It's just that fossil fuels are so darn effective and cheap that it's hard to get us to move away.
That raises a really good point, too, in part because one of the big reasons on Beacon Hill that folks have been a little bit more conservative with subsidies for renewable energy, because they're talking about we have to create a stable market. We have to create a stable marketplace where they don't need the same kind of subsidies to be able to flourish and bloom. First, the argument I find a little bit specious because fossil fuels have been subsidized for the better part of a century, but what have you. But the beautiful thing about this is that this basic fundamental shift in how we think about cost does that for these renewable markets. We just literally, this summer with the Act to Promote Energy Diversity, the big energy omnibus bill that was passed in Massachusetts, we just set out procurement, or will be setting out procurement for the single largest offshore wind procurement, in the history of this country.
Is that the Block Island thing?
Not Block Island. So these will be new procurements.
this is new.
Yeah. So between Danish offshore wind, Deepwater Horizon, those companies. So if we want to continue to grow these markets and grow them in a way that meets the demands of our political leadership, this is a way to ensure that happens without upping subsidy amounts for these industries. The other point that I would make, because Dave raises a really good point about demand over time, the more that we continue to allow this kind of expansion of climate change to go unchecked, we're increasing demand for services that we're already funding publicly, which effectively undercuts the good that money is doing. So if we are trying to, an example that I like to use is some of the community work that Boston Children's Hospital is doing around asthma. If we are making it harder and harder and harder, either through gas leaks and climate change or just heat increases, to service those populations, speaking as a former healthcare organizer, we're going to increase demand, and if we can't meet demand, we're going to increase overall cost of the system because of shocks that either chronic incidents or catastrophic health emergencies create. So if we can't even meet demand with currently how we're funding our public health, our inability to meet demand in the future, it's just going to increase costs in the system. So this is a long-term investment, both from a climate, both from a industry perspective, as well as from a public health perspective.
I had a question about that I wanted to get to is about revenue neutrality. And that's one of the attractivenesses of this carbon fee and dividend. I wonder if you want to talk about that.
Yeah. So let me put it to you this way. If you are the average person, you use the same amount of fuel, you use the same amount of energy as everyone around you, let's say, most people around you. Right? The government comes to you and says, we'd like you to pony up $100 a month, and then we're going to take that money and we're going to spend it on something else. We're going to invest it in a new solar field. We're going to invest it in new roads, right? Sometimes you say that's great, right? The government has to do that. We wouldn't have roads if there wasn't government, right? So taxes do have a purpose. But sometimes you say, darn it, I feel like I pay enough to the government. I don't really want them to spend my money. By taking all the money that's collected in the fees and giving it back, what we are saying to consumers is the government isn't picking how to spend the money, you are. You get to make the choice on which energies you want to buy. So over the long run, the real advantage of this, there are two real advantages. One, it means the government doesn't have to pick winners and losers. Okay? When people talk about government investment in clean energy, all the time you hear someone will bring up a failure, a bad bet. The government invested in Solyndra and Solyndra failed. Right? And everyone's sad, and that's the reason why the government shouldn't do this. Well, instead of having the government have to pick the right one, let's let the economy, let's let every consumer in every business pick what makes sense for them and just give them a price signal. Hey, we'd like you to move away from fossil fuels, and so we're going to make them more expensive over time, but you figure out what you want to do next.
My impression of the neutrality is that it may be a little more attractive to a wider spectrum of voters.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because if we make it a tax, that word, that's got some negative connotations. That causes people some heartache. The other reason to make it revenue neutral, if your bank account is protected every month, right, and I tell you that a gallon of gas is going to go up, this year it's going to be 20 cents more, and next year it's going to be 40 cents more, and next year it's going to be 60 cents more, but you're going to get a check in the mail, right, that protects you for that cost, that's not so scary. But if I tell you you're not going to get a check in the mail that's going to offset your cost, that's going to make you kind of scared, right? We can have a bigger fee. We can be more aggressive in steering away from fossil fuels if people know they're going to get money back to protect them from the increased costs.
Can you give us, I was going to ask, can you give us an idea of what, some numbers, some example numbers?
Perfect. I'm going to segue to one of my charts here. So at the state and national level, we have looked into this. We've had big kind of math studies, hired respected companies who do economic modeling. These are companies who the government hires when they're trying to consider what happens if the Affordable Health Care Act goes in, what's it going to do, right? How is it going to change the system?
As well as by our own public institutions, DOER, the Department of Energy Resources, has studied carbon pricing multiple times.
That's the Massachusetts.
Yes.
Yeah. So at both the national and state levels, there have been big studies done to say, what's this actually going to do? And most of these studies are framed not as environmental policy, but as financial policy. Because the concern is, I mean, we know it's going to...
Or economic policy.
Or economic policy.
Yeah, even better.
Because while we want to improve the environment, the big concern is always, how is this going to hurt individuals? How's it going to hurt businesses? So let's look at a national study.
Or help.
Or help. So in 2014, there was a big study looking at a national bill. And the parameters of the bill were, it was essentially put $10 per ton of carbon emitted, and then that would go up by another 10 per year indefinitely. Right?
In Massachusetts, it's a $5 increase for the proposed bill. So I believe it would start at $10 and increase
By 5 each year.
By 5 each year till we capped out at $40 per ton.
And to give you a point of comparison, right? What this means in terms of your dollar value at home. Let's say $10 per ton means you got a monthly bill. It's like $100 more per month. Except you're then getting a check that's $100 back. And so then that escalates every year. So it's a significant amount of money, except you're also getting protected from it. With that kind of bill in place, at a national level, over 20 years, we'd reduce our emissions by 50%. There is no other policy we've considered. You know, we talked about regulations earlier, or cap and trade. Nothing else comes even close to bringing our emissions down that fast.
Especially in the sectors where we need to bring it down, where we have very little policy in terms of being able to equitably bring it down. In fact, in Massachusetts, we have what's called the Global Warming Solutions Act, which was passed in 2008 by Senator Mark Pacheco, who's also a carbon pricing bill sponsor, which we can get to in a second. But the whole point of the Global Warming Solutions Act is that it takes our 1990 base carbon emission numbers and sets legal mandates for us to reduce those emissions by certain years. So by 2050, we have to reduce 80% of our 1990 emission numbers. So take those 1990 numbers, chop them by 80%. Right now, we are not on track to hit those numbers. We're not even close. So something like a carbon fee would do a massive amount to move us in the right direction. It's probably one of the few things that could.
In the same way, the United States federal government just signed the Paris Accord, right? And there's this new international climate treaty where all these countries around the world have set targets for how much they're going to reduce their emissions.
I think, as I understand, they're going to start doing the carbon pricing throughout Europe.
So Europe has a carbon pricing mechanism in place already that
In
they're
some countries,
expanding.
like half a dozen countries or so.
Yup. And you also see China has come to the table and said they're exploring a carbon tax and also carbon markets, so a cap and trade in China.
And Canada is about to take British Columbia's model and expand it federally. So actually the basis for the carbon fee and rebate as proposed in Massachusetts is the British Columbia model that was offered.
That's a pretty good model because British Columbia, I don't believe they have their own source of fossil fuels.
So that's
So they're sort of similar to us, I think, maybe.
So they're a pretty analogous market to us. There's a couple really good stats that come out of that. First and foremost, they've reduced emissions significantly over the past 8 years. They also now own a disproportionate share of the renewable energy market relative to the rest of the country. It is the most popular tax in the province, which is pretty interesting. They do the mechanism a little bit differently in terms of how folks experience it. Folks get the rebate back first and then experience the fee. But how that would be handled in Massachusetts is understandably left up to DOR in the language. And also the openness is left so that we can make sure that the rebate gets to as many people in the most equitable and efficient way as possible.
Yeah. So to back up for the audience here, the province of British Columbia in Canada implemented a tax on carbon, and then in exchange for that tax, they have some of the monies go back as rebates, and other monies they use to reduce other taxes. So business taxes, they reduce the tax rates for businesses and add this carbon tax instead.
So they add a little bit of politics to the
That's
mix.
right.
I noticed also they give some exceptions. I don't know if they do it, but in reading about carbon pricing, sometimes agriculture gets a few breaks. Do you know anything about that?
So, kind of generally speaking, there are, with public policies, there are lots of different people looking for breaks, right? Looking for
To tax.
mechanisms to protect themselves, right?
Yeah, like any tax.
Like any tax, right? And it has been, industries that have been brought up, energy-intensive industries, people who live and have to commute a very long distance,
Yep.
right? Low-income households that can't afford to pay the fees, agriculture sectors, other energy-intensive sectors. One of the reasons that at both the state and national level, the fee and dividend mechanism is so nice is that it doesn't include a lot of those extras. The goal is to have something that is fair and consistent for every industry and to not add those extra breaks in. Because every time you add a break in, which is something that government has to do oftentimes as part of the political process, it changes the market a little bit. It distorts the market a little bit. And it gives one sector or one company an unfair advantage. So our goal is to try and solve the problem of emissions and leave it up to all the other businesses and individuals to pick and choose as they see fit, and not to give unfair advantages to particular sectors.
So there's a couple things there. The first is that there is, I think you mentioned, people who are driving over long distances. In Mass, that additional rebate is built in. So your central Mass communities, whether it's in the Pioneer Valley or just west of Worcester, who are commuting very long distances, if you drive more than 30% of the state average, you'll get an additional rebate calculated into your rebate under the Barrett bill. And this is also, and looking at the British Columbia model, kind of provides both some pros for the revenue positive, because the Coalition for a Clean Energy Future, which is the Mass Carbon Pricing Coalition, supports both a revenue positive bill as well as a revenue neutral bill. And there's kind of two ways to cut at the same thing a little bit. Everything that Dave said about a revenue neutral bill is true. It's one of the big reasons why Senator Barrett put forward. Senator Barrett actually originally put forward a revenue positive model and switched to a revenue neutral model because one of the reasons was it would be a little bit more politically salient, or at least politically feasible, was what was offered. And at the same time, looking at some of the findings that the Department of Energy Revenue, or Energy Resources, kind of raised around a carbon price, that we would see modest job creation, that we would see some increase in disposable income. Those, and part of my organization's caring about is climate justice, about the frontline affected communities. We still have to answer for the few cases where families who are on the low income poverty schedule still don't come out ahead on the back end of a rebate. So that might mean an additional rebate for those kinds of households, and be able to effectively model that. It also doesn't answer the question of what kinds of jobs do we want to create, and can the rebates that we put forward effectively and reinvest and transform communities as a whole to be more emission friendly than not. One of the things I really like about a revenue neutral model is that it demands systemic change of not just of individuals, but of whole systems, of how municipalities operate. And that's true for a revenue neutral model as well. A revenue positive model. A revenue positive model that Senator Pacheco put forward would take 20% of the overall rebate money, keep 80% in the rebate model that Dave's talking about, and take that additional 20% for transportation and clean energy projects. I don't know if that bill is going to be refiled, but how that money moves forward and how we can best both reduce emissions and effectively serve populations that need to be served and protect those vulnerable populations is a big question.
I was going to ask a question about, do you have any numbers about what we might expect? You talked about emissions going down over, was it 20 years?
Yep.
Half in 20 years. Well, what about gross national product or gross domestic product, gross state product?
How does it affect the economy?
It's the economy. So what's it going to mean for that wonderful word, jobs?
So let's look at the national one first. So I had mentioned earlier, we talked about how much the emissions would get reduced, but looking at the economic impact. So if I said to you, we're going to reduce emissions by half, you'd say, what's it going to cost me? Which is fair. And if I said it's going to cost you a whole bunch of money and a whole bunch of jobs, you'd still consider it, probably, at least a little bit. But what if I said to you, it not only doesn't cost you any money, it gives you money and gives you jobs?
I want to know why we're not doing it right now.
I mean, you'd probably say I must be making it up, right? You wouldn't believe that.
I would like to know why we haven't done it yet.
You'd be skeptical. So there are a couple reasons we haven't done it yet, and we can cover that in a moment. But the economic models show it actually is at least net neutral in jobs, if not a net benefit in terms of the number of jobs.
So what if you were going to take a guess, an educated guess, what do you think it would do? Can you give us a number, a percentage, or some rough? estimate of what it might do for the economy?
Okay, so to give you some actual numbers, which are out of context, so forgive me. In terms of number of jobs created at the national level, 2.1 million jobs after 10 years. Right? And how are those jobs being created? Well, two things. One, you've got investment in clean energy technologies, and so there's a certain sector that's going to be growing.
Yep.
The other thing is that when people are spending less money on fossil fuels, because they're moving away from fossil fuels, they're spending their money on something else. And what do people tend to use extra money in their pockets on? There are several other sectors that tend to do very well. For example, healthcare tends to do very well because people have health expenses they want to pay. If they got more money in their pockets, that's one of the sectors that they will tend to spend it on. Retail does pretty well. The auto industry actually does remarkably well, both because people are encouraged to buy new, more efficient cars, but also because they have more money in their pockets to use to buy cars. And when you look at the total monies that are now flowing less toward fossil fuel companies like Shell and Exxon, and more toward all these other small opportunities where people are spending a little bit of money here and there, it ends up, on the whole, creating more jobs. Now, if we look at the state level.
That's good. I wanted to ask you questions about Massachusetts.
Okay. So if we look at the state level of just a state carbon price, the DOER study, which is the Department of Energy Resources, which is a state agency, they found that, one, it was feasible to return all the money. In other words, the government doesn't have to keep a hold of it. It doesn't have to cost a lot of government administration.
And we can deliver it multiple ways.
And it increased employment, increased other economic indicators like how much money the state makes, and again, reduced emissions substantially. At the state level, they were looking at somewhere between a 20 and 30% reduction in emissions over 15 years.
With job growth, it's somewhere, remind me correctly, if it's, I believe 4,000 to 10,000 jobs over the same space of time.
Right.
So, and this is kind of where we get back into what kind of jobs are we creating. There's no guarantee that these are union jobs, which is something I think that some folks take issue with, as well as what are the things that we're funding. I think the massively positive thing coming out of the DOER study is that there's nothing negative coming out of this. There's no significant industry that is harmed. You can deliver this to the public, whether through EBT benefits, through quarterly or monthly rebate checks back to folks. This is easily deliverable with little overhead. This is doable. It's simply a matter of political will.
Yeah. And so then, if we look at broad trends across both of these for the state of Massachusetts, again, the sectors that do very well, healthcare, retail, construction also does very well because, again, people have money in their pockets. They will use it for housing and for housing-related purchases. Okay? The sectors that lose, not surprisingly, utilities, because people are using less energy, or they're trying to get energy from other sources. But let's be honest. If the goal is to reduce fossil fuels, and the industry that's hurt is the fossil fuel industry, that's kind of the point. Like, that's exactly our goal, is to reduce the amount of fossil fuels we're using. And it's not that we dislike that industry, we want to take it on them. It's that that industry is causing damage to our environment. And that damage has big financial costs that they aren't paying for. And we need to move away from it to avoid some of that long-term damage and to reduce the amount of costs we have to pay for that damage.
Exactly. I'm trying to remember correctly. I believe the only other institution, we brought it up earlier in Massachusetts, that would potentially come out slightly behind would be energy-intensive institutions. So besides concrete, I'm trying to remember what the others are, if they appeal. But concrete and
there are a few select manufacturing areas that are energy-intensive.
That's correct.
Frankly, again, we want the big users to be encouraged to become more energy efficient.
Exactly.
Right? If you're a facility that uses a lot of energy and you're now encouraged to invest more in solar or to look for ways to use less energy, that's great. That's a victory because, again, the real problem is emissions. If we can reduce the amount of energy we're using and reduce emissions, That's going to make us better in the long run.
Exactly.
Where are we legislatively? I mean, I know Massachusetts has a complex process of passing laws. So I'd like to have a rough idea of where we are and what's in front of us. What are the barriers? What are the things we need to do? Because our viewers at home might say, "This is a great idea. What should I do? Where should I go? Is there anybody I should contact to move this forward?"
Andrew, let's start at the state level.
So at the state level, if you're interested in getting involved in moving this forward, look up the Campaign for a Clean Energy Future. That's the statewide carbon pricing coalition, of which North Shore CCL and 350 Massachusetts are both members. Very proudly have been doing this for a while. What we're trying to do, and kind of give you a picture of where things are. Carbon pricing was almost included as a component of the omnibus bill that got passed this summer around energy diversity and improving.
So it's already been written up.
So it's been written up.
It's been researched, and they had their legal minds put together a bill.
Oh yes. So this,
it's already on a piece of paper somewhere.
So this is Senator Barrett's, one of the senators' number one, if not his number one priority. The bill, I believe, got 47 co-sponsors last time around, or at
Which
least
is like 25% of the people on Beacon Hill?
more than 25% of the legislature. There's significant support in the Senate. I think the challenge moving forward with the carbon price in Massachusetts is crafting a proposal that in its details appeals to members of House leadership, as well as base members of the House who have to go back to their constituents and sell the policy. I think that's a big focus of what we're going to be doing moving forward. Because we've done a lot of good work in the Senate, we're going to continue to do a lot of good work. If you ask the senator, publicly in the past couple of years, he said this is a multi-year campaign. There's a couple of factors at play that might help move it along. The Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts recently put down a ruling in Kane, in the Kane decision, that the administration has to set up volumetric caps to meet its 2020 Global Warming Solutions Act standard. So how this helps carbon pricing, not directly, but at least moves the conversation and keeps us attached to our emissions goals. Secondly, we have passed this energy omnibus bill, and moving that forward and moving that along and making sure these markets are stable is a big incentive moving forward with some of these different projects. I think third, the big thing is with the Fair Share Amendment campaign to tax millionaires, people, I believe at 4% over $1 million in revenue, is an interesting interaction with carbon pricing, at least in terms of a revenue neutral model. So you're not saying, hey, we're not generating an additional fee, we're just trying to get something to reduce emissions and ensure that you have additional protection, as Dave's kind of talked about throughout the evening. So I think we are looking at a multi-year campaign. We're looking at something that has a significant amount of upward momentum.
So does it have to go through the House first?
If it is a revenue positive bill, yes. So anything generating revenue has to start in the House. Revenue that will be used in the general operating fund of the legislature will be used in the House, has to start in the House and move forward from there. I think the argument that the Senate has used the past year or so is that if a bill is revenue neutral and doesn't take money that goes into the general operating fund, that's technically not a tax, it is a fee. Therefore, it can start in the Senate, get passed in the Senate, and then get pushed back to the House.
Would that make it easier to pass?
The Senate would believe so. I don't think the House agrees with their overall approval.
If it had no revenue impact, would that mean, in general, would that make an easier bill in a procedural way? Would it be less things for it to do, or still the same amount of capacity?
It wouldn't have a procedural impact because it still has to move through the House. The ultimate political wrangling on this is a little bit more complex. Precisely because you have folks who, after the gas tax indexing failed 2 years ago, people are very, very gun shy about even something that would be set aside in a separate lockbox for funding, whether on transportation, on clean energy. I mean, I believe it was question 1 got absolutely, or it was question 2, got slaughtered at the ballot box 2 years ago. And that was for an additional fee on your gas tax that would have sent money directly into a lockbox for transportation projects, for roads and bridges, for RTAs, all of that stuff. Stuff that people see, feel, experience every single day. I think people are still a little bit gun shy about coming out for something that feels a little bit like that. So I think there's political safety in a revenue neutral model. At the same time, I would imagine that there are folks who are interested in something that would generate revenue to be able to sell projects to their constituents. So I think really what this comes down to is having folks meet with their legislators in district, do education up on Beacon Hill, just doing the hard work of making a campaign happen. Yes, we are.
We're producing a TV show.
Thank you for having me on.
So I'm slightly biased. Andrew said that the House may be looking at tweaks to the bill. Frankly, I think the bill that we've got in place right now, like under consideration, or we had under consideration during the last session, was a great bill. I thought it was quite comprehensive and included most everything you would want. And so from my outside perspective, the barrier is that there's not enough public support and public awareness to encourage members of the House to take action on it. Right? If we have more public pressure or just public dialogue, getting people talking about this and getting people talking about it in a way where they're not scared of it because they don't see it as a government tax that's going to hurt their pocketbooks, but they see it as a way to, over the long term, protect them from damage from climate change while also creating jobs, protecting their own bank accounts. Like that's a pretty powerful message. So I think if we get regular folks just talking with their members of the legislature, calling up your state representative and say, hey, have you heard of this bill? What do you think of it? Are you aware of it? Let's have a conversation about it. And if we have conversation between members of the public and their legislators, I think that may drive more action than anything else. Because as you said, the concern about the gasoline tax that didn't get through the vote, right? Votes make members of Congress leery, or make members of the State House leery, right? If they see something that the public is not supporting, they're going to be hesitant to want to act on. If we can show public support, that will give them a lot more incentive to act.
Has anybody thought about doing a referendum?
I think a lot of folks are leery of a referendum precisely because of what happened with the gas tax indexing. I think also further to Dave's point, carbon pricing kind of had to wait in line a little bit last term because we were talking about two really massive issues that were immediate for folks. We were talking about whether or not we were going to subsidize, actually really three, how we were going to handle solar subsidies once we hit the net metering caps, and we can have a whole separate conversation just explaining what net metering is, but how we handled solar subsidies, how we were going to handle charging ratepayers to build a new pipeline, and how we were going to handle offshore wind subsidies. So we had three really, really big issues that from really Thanksgiving of last year until just the end of July sucked up the entirety of the big conversation, the big picture, ambitious thinking around what renewable energy policy could look like. So now that those three big things, well, really two and a half, we're going to have to address solar again in the new year anyway, because we have hit the caps again, or we will soon hit the caps again. There really is a lot more space now for this kind of really proactive vision around what our next step renewable policy could look like. I think you'll hear folks talk a little bit about doubling what's known as the renewable portfolio standard, the amount of electricity that utility companies have to purchase from renewable energy sources, doubling that rather than just have its 1% increase over time. But really, if you're talking about what the next, what our emission reduction policy looks like, the only serious emission reduction policy that is looking forward towards the GWSA goals is a carbon fee.